What happens when a woman's inheritance is stolen by the one person she's supposed to trust? Helen quietly searches for the truth, and discovers a hidden will that changes everything. What happened next left the whole family reeling. For as long as Helen Fisher could remember, her family's grand old house stood as the centerpiece of every story, every memory, and every secret. It was a sprawling, weathered Victorian on a quiet hill, its gardens wild and beautiful, filled with the laughter of generations. Her father, Albert Fisher, was a man of discipline and dignity, and even in his final years, he insisted on maintaining tradition. Holiday feasts, summer picnics, long evenings of card games in the parlor. But as the years wore on, the house became a stage for a quieter battle, the question of what would become of everything he'd built. Helen was Albert's only child by his first wife, who had passed away when Helen was just 7. Her stepmother, Diane, had arrived soon after, bringing with her a cloud of suspicion and a sharp tongue. While Helen spent her childhood trying to win Diane's approval, nothing was ever quite enough. As Helen grew older, she learned to keep her distance, maintaining a cordial politeness while relying on her own friends, her work as a teacher, and the sanctuary of her father's library. After Albert's health began to fail, Diane became more controlling. She managed the household staff, intercepted phone calls, and insisted on overseeing every doctor's visit. Helen, though still her father's confidant, often found herself excluded from conversations and decisions. She worried about the future, especially as Diane became more insistent about sorting out the estate. One brisk November afternoon, Helen arrived at the house to find Diane waiting in the foyer, a letter in her hand. "Your father's will," Diane announced, her lips twisted into a thin smile. "He wanted you to know that he's taken care of everything." The tone in her voice made Helen's stomach twist with unease. Helen visited her father in his study, where he lay resting under a heavy quilt, his face pale but eyes sharp. "You know I love you, Helen," he whispered. "But some things, they're not in my hands anymore." He squeezed her hand, his gaze lingering. She sensed a warning in his eyes, but before she could ask, Diane bustled in with his medication, ending the conversation. Albert passed away 2 weeks later. The funeral was subdued, family, a few neighbors, and several of Albert's old business partners. Helen felt adrift in her own childhood home, surrounded by faces that seemed suddenly distant. Diane took charge, making arrangements, fielding condolences, and ensuring that Helen was always kept on the periphery. A week after the burial, Diane called a meeting in the formal dining room. Helen arrived to find Diane seated at the head of the table, her lawyer beside her, an official-looking envelope between them. "Thank you for coming, Helen. This won't take long," Diane began, her voice formal. She opened the envelope and read aloud, Albert's last will and testament. To Helen's shock, the will stated that the entirety of the estate, house, investments, valuables, would go to Diane. Helen was allotted a small trust fund, enough for a few years of modest living, but nothing compared to what she had expected, nor what her father had always promised her. Diane's expression was triumphant, her tone cool. "I'm sorry, dear. Your father wanted to make sure I was secure. I know this must be difficult, but it's what's best." Helen's world spun. She thought of the quiet conversations she and her father had shared, his assurances that she would always have a home, his pride in passing down the family legacy. None of it made sense. She stared at Diane, who watched her with satisfaction, then at the lawyer, who avoided Helen's gaze. "Where is the original will?" Helen asked, her voice trembling. "The one Dad had drafted years ago?" Diane shrugged. "This is the only will. You're welcome to contest it, but I doubt it will make a difference." Everything was filed with the family attorney. Helen sat in silence as Diane and her lawyer continued, distributing inventories and instructions. When the meeting ended, Helen wandered the house in a daze. She found herself in her father's library, running her fingers over the spines of his old books. She remembered a phrase he'd once whispered, "If you ever need answers, look where I always looked for hope." That night, Helen didn't sleep. She replayed every detail of the past weeks, searching for something she'd missed. She decided she couldn't accept Diane's story, not when everything about her father's wishes felt wrong. In the early hours, Helen resolved to investigate. She would look for clues, speak with her father's friends, and search every corner of the house. Diane had claimed the inheritance was hers. But Helen, heartbroken yet stubborn, was determined to uncover the truth, no matter how deeply it was buried. Helen's days became consumed by a new obsession. She no longer entered her childhood home as a guest. She prowled its halls as a quiet investigator, searching for cracks in Diane's story. Each time she visited, she found Diane in a different room, barking orders at the staff or locking herself in the office with stacks of legal papers. The atmosphere was tense, each word between them brittle as glass. Helen started in the library. Her father's favorite room was filled with memories: his old desk, the leather chair by the window, the faint scent of pipe tobacco still lingering in the curtains. She pulled out drawers, checked under shelves, and leafed through his beloved first editions. At first, there was nothing. But then she remembered his whispered advice: "If you ever need answers, look where I always looked for hope." She stared at the worn Bible that had belonged to her grandmother, always kept within reach. Tucked inside its cover, Helen found a slip of paper, a list of dates and initials, some circled in red. The handwriting was shaky but unmistakably her father's. One date, 2 years prior, was marked with a star and the word Lawson. Puzzled, Helen called her father's longtime friend and former business partner, Arthur Lawson. He answered on the second ring, his voice warm but wary. After a moment's hesitation, Helen shared her suspicions about the will. Arthur listened in silence, then sighed. "Your father confided in me, Helen. He was worried about Diane's intentions. He asked me to witness the drafting of a new will, but he kept the details private. I do remember him visiting a safe deposit box shortly after. Have you checked his personal records?" Helen's heart pounded. "No, Diane has all the keys and paperwork." Arthur lowered his voice. "There's always a way, Helen. Your father was thorough. Look for something that doesn't belong. He liked puzzles." That night, Helen wandered the house after Diane went to bed. She searched her father's study and the old roll-top desk in the guest room. In the back of a drawer, beneath a false bottom, she found a small velvet pouch. Inside was a single brass key and a folded slip of paper with a bank's name and box number. Helen waited until morning, then hurried to the bank, nerves taut with hope and dread. The staff, after confirming her identity, escorted her to a private room. She turned the key in the small safe deposit box, and inside found a sealed envelope labeled in her father's hand, "For Helen, in the event of my death." Hands trembling, Helen opened the envelope. Inside were 2 documents: a letter from her father, expressing his love and regret for the burdens of the past, and a copy of an entirely different will, one drafted and notarized with Arthur Lawson as witness. In it, her father left the house, the majority of investments, and the family heirlooms to Helen, providing only a modest allowance for Diane. Helen sat in shock, her father's words blurring as tears filled her eyes. This was the will she remembered him promising. The letter closed with a simple line: "Trust yourself, Helen. I know you'll do what's right." She copied the documents, then carefully replaced them in the box, leaving the originals untouched. Helen called Arthur on her way home, voice shaking with both triumph and anxiety. "I found it. The real will. What should I do?" Arthur advised her to contact a lawyer immediately. "And don't confront Diane alone. She's more cunning than you know." Back at the house, Helen's demeanor shifted. She smiled when Diane tried to corner her in the hallway, feigning ignorance. That afternoon, while Diane hosted a luncheon for her social club, Helen met quietly with a local attorney, showing her the copy of the true will and her father's letter. The lawyer was stunned. "This changes everything. If the original will was suppressed, we can challenge Diane's claim. But you must act carefully. If Diane realizes what you found, she may try to destroy the original documents or manipulate the estate further." Helen agreed. She felt an odd combination of fear and exhilaration. For the first time since her father's death, hope surged in her veins. She was no longer the powerless daughter, brushed aside by a stepmother's ambition. She was the rightful heir, the keeper of her father's wishes, and now she had proof. That night, Helen began preparing for the next step. She gathered all correspondence, old photographs, and financial statements. She reviewed the will, memorizing every clause. And she steeled herself for a confrontation she knew was coming. Diane had claimed everything, basking in her ill-gotten victory. But Helen, with the truth in hand and her father's blessing in her heart, was ready to challenge everything. Helen's world shifted with the weight of the secret she now carried. The copy of her father's true will was locked away in her handbag, never far from her side. For the first time since the funeral, she walked the halls of the family home with her head held high, but with each step, the tension between her and Diane grew more taut, like a wire about to snap. Diane sensed a change, though she couldn't name it. She began keeping closer watch, instructing the staff to report Helen's movements, intercepting her mail, even insisting that Helen sign a guest log whenever she entered or left the house. The atmosphere turned icy. Meals together were brief, conversation forced. Diane filled the silences with pointed remarks. "It's not easy keeping a house of this size. So much responsibility, so much paperwork. I hope you're not getting overwhelmed, Helen." Helen responded only with polite smiles, biding her time, observing Diane's every move. She noticed the way Diane hovered near the study whenever Helen was in the library, or how she would suddenly appear in the hallway if Helen so much as paused at a locked door. It was clear. Diane was guarding secrets of her own. Helen's attorney, Ms. Walker, worked quickly. She ordered a full record search, tracing every document Diane had filed since Albert's death. She contacted the family's financial advisor, who admitted, off the record, that he had been pressured to accelerate the transfer of assets to Diane. "She said it was urgent, for your father's medical bills," he explained, his voice tinged with regret. "I should have known better." Arthur Lawson remained Helen's closest ally, advising her to gather as much supporting evidence as possible before making her move. "Diane is clever, Helen. She'll twist any detail to her advantage if you're not careful." Together, they dug through old storage boxes in the attic, searching for additional letters or documents in Albert's handwriting. One rainy afternoon, Helen made a discovery that sent chills down her spine. In the back of a dusty trunk, wedged behind a stack of photo albums, she found an ornate wooden box. Inside, tucked beneath faded medals and childhood sketches, was an audio cassette labeled in Albert's careful hand, "For Helen." She borrowed an old tape player from a neighbor and sat cross-legged on her bedroom floor, pressing play with trembling fingers. Her father's voice, faint but clear, filled the room. "If you're hearing this, Helen, I'm gone, and things have likely become complicated. You must know I wanted you to have the house, our home. I made arrangements to protect you, but I fear Diane may not honor them. If you're lost, look for the ledger I kept behind the study bookshelf. And remember, the lawyer you can trust is Ms. Walker. She helped me draft everything. I love you. Trust yourself." Helen wept, then set to work. That night, when the house was quiet, she snuck into the study and examined the bookcase. After several minutes, she found a loose panel. Inside was a battered old ledger. Its pages contained a record of family heirlooms, bank accounts, investments, and, most damning, a handwritten note from Albert. This ledger details the assets to be inherited by Helen Fisher. No other party is to claim them. With the ledger and the cassette as evidence, Helen felt her confidence solidify. She documented everything, scanning pages and keeping originals hidden in multiple secure locations. She and Ms. Walker devised a legal strategy. They would present the evidence of the true will, the letter, the cassette, and the ledger, demanding an injunction to freeze the estate's distribution until the court could rule. Diane, oblivious to Helen's preparations, grew increasingly agitated. She scheduled repairs for the house that never materialized, tried to pressure Helen to move on with her life, and even hinted at finding a buyer for the property, without Helen's input. One evening, Helen overheard Diane on the phone in the garden. "Don't worry. She won't be a problem much longer. I'll take care of it, just like I always do." That was the final straw. Helen called Ms. Walker and Arthur. "I'm ready," she said. "It's time." The next day, Helen's lawyer filed the paperwork to challenge Diane's claim, attaching copies of the will, the letter, the ledger, and the tape's transcript. They served Diane official notice, delivered, ironically, in the same formal dining room where Diane had once declared herself owner of everything. Diane read the documents with shaking hands, her face a mask of fury and disbelief. "You don't know what you're doing, Helen. This will ruin everything." Helen met her gaze, steady and unwavering. "No, Diane. I'm saving everything. For Dad. For the family. For what's right." As Helen left the room, the first rays of hope shone through the storm. The fight was only beginning, but for the first time, Helen felt she was on the side of justice, and that the truth, finally, was on her side. In the days following the formal challenge, Helen's life became a whirlwind of legal preparation and emotional turbulence. Every morning began with a flurry of calls to Ms. Walker, the lawyer, and Arthur. They reviewed evidence, rehearsed statements, and mapped out timelines. Helen's nerves were stretched thin, but her resolve only deepened with each hour. Diane, on the other hand, unleashed her full arsenal. She moved swiftly, freezing joint accounts, canceling utilities in Helen's name, and even trying to have Helen's access to the house revoked. She spread rumors among neighbors and distant relatives, painting Helen as greedy and unstable, claiming, "She's trying to take what isn't hers, just like her mother did." Some believed Diane's stories, their support faltering. Others remembered Helen's kindness over the years and quietly offered comfort. Arthur proved invaluable. He spent hours compiling written testimonies from those who had witnessed Albert's intentions: nurses, household staff, and old friends. Many recalled conversations where Albert had explicitly stated his desire for Helen to inherit the house and the bulk of his estate. Even Mrs. Pollard, the long-retired housekeeper, returned with a handwritten letter. "Albert told me himself, Helen will always have a home here, no matter what Diane says." Meanwhile, Helen's attorney filed an emergency petition in probate court, requesting that the court freeze all estate transactions until the matter could be heard. The judge, reviewing the evidence, especially the copy of the Real will, the ledger, and the heartfelt tape, agreed. A temporary injunction was issued, preventing Diane from selling the house or transferring major assets. The legal battle took its toll. Diane became erratic, issuing veiled threats and making desperate, late-night phone calls to family attorneys. Once, Helen caught her in the act of shredding documents in her private study. When Helen confronted her, Diane's eyes flashed with rage. "You think you're so clever, Helen? You don't know what I've sacrificed for this family. I deserve it all." Helen stood her ground. "What you deserve, Diane, is the truth. Dad wanted this family to be whole, not torn apart for your ambition." Court hearings began the following week. The house felt emptier than ever as Helen dressed each morning for court, always clutching her father's letter in her purse for strength. Ms. Walker guided her through tense testimony, where Diane's lawyer tried to poke holes in every memory, every date. But the tape, the ledger, and Arthur's account withstood the attacks. The judge pressed Diane about her sudden claim to the estate. Faced with mounting evidence, she floundered, her explanations growing increasingly wild. She tried to claim Albert had changed his mind but produced no documentation, no witnesses, only her own word. Outside the courthouse, media interest began to grow. A local reporter, tipped off by an old friend of Helen's, started asking questions about the heiress and the missing will. The pressure mounted. Neighbors grew wary of Diane's dramatic outbursts. Helen kept her dignity, greeting everyone with the same calm grace her father had taught her. Inside the house, Helen found small reminders of her father's presence: an old chest set by the window, his gardening hat in the mudroom, a dried flower pressed in a book. Each gave her strength to push forward, to resist Diane's intimidation. She made a point of inviting loyal family friends for tea, keeping her world full of warmth and allies. At every turn, Diane tried to regain control. She locked Helen out of her old bedroom, hired private security, and even attempted to bribe the gardener for dirt on Helen's past. Yet, every scheme failed to dislodge the mountain of evidence now before the court. The final hearing loomed, a day when everything would come to light. Helen's heart thudded with anxiety, but Arthur and Ms. Walker assured her, "The truth is on your side. Your father's wishes will be honored." The night before the hearing, Helen sat in the library, reading her father's favorite poetry and listening to the tape one more time. Tears fell, but her spirit was strong. She knew her fight was not just for herself, but for every promise her father had ever made. She fell asleep in the armchair, comforted by memories, ready to face the last battle at dawn. The morning of the final court hearing dawned cold and bright, sunlight glinting on the frost-laced windows of the old family house. Helen woke with a mixture of dread and hope twisting in her stomach. She dressed carefully in a dark suit that had belonged to her mother, pinning her father's silver watch to her lapel for strength. Her phone buzzed with messages of encouragement. Arthur's was brief but firm: "You've got this. For Albert." Helen arrived at the courthouse to find a small crowd gathered: journalists, neighbors, even some former staff from her childhood. Diane was already there, flanked by her lawyer and a few of her socialite friends, her face set in a mask of icy composure. Ms. Walker greeted Helen with a reassuring nod, then led her inside. The courtroom was tense. The judge, a stern woman with a reputation for fairness, began by summarizing the case. "We are here to determine the validity of Albert Fisher's final will and the rightful distribution of his estate." Diane's lawyer made the first argument, insisting that Albert's last wishes had been carried out and that Helen was simply confused by grief. Then it was Helen's turn. Ms. Walker presented the copy of the real will, Albert's letter, the ledger from the hidden compartment, and the transcript of the cassette recording. She called Arthur Lawson and Mrs. Pollard to the stand. Both testified to Albert's clear intentions for Helen to inherit the home and the majority of assets. Helen took the stand last. She described her search for the truth, her father's coded message in the Bible, and the overwhelming sense of betrayal and determination that had guided her. When Ms. Walker asked what her father's legacy meant to her, Helen spoke with quiet conviction. "This house and everything it holds is not just property, it's family. My father taught me that we honor the past by protecting the future. I fight not out of greed, but for his promise to me, and for all the love he gave." Diane's cross-examination was brutal. Her lawyer painted Helen as opportunistic and vengeful. But Helen remained composed, answering each question truthfully, refusing to let bitterness creep into her voice. The judge listened intently, taking notes, occasionally asking clarifying questions about dates and signatures. Then, Diane herself was called to testify. Her answers were evasive. When pressed about why she had never produced any witnesses or documentation for her claims, she faltered. Under oath, she tried to cast suspicion on the legitimacy of the new will and even accused Helen of manipulating Arthur and the staff. The judge saw through her performance. Diane's answers grew shriller as her narrative unraveled. Court recessed for lunch. Outside, Helen stood on the courthouse steps, shivering in the weak sunlight, Arthur and Ms. Walker by her side. "You did well," Ms. Walker said softly. "Truth is simple. Lies are complicated. The judge will see that." After lunch, the judge returned with a decision. The courtroom fell silent as she spoke. "The evidence submitted overwhelmingly supports the existence of a more recent will drafted by Mr. Albert Fisher, witnessed by Mr. Arthur Lawson and corroborated by physical and audio records. The court finds in favor of Ms. Helen Fisher. The estate, as outlined in the will, will be transferred to her, with provisions made for Mrs. Diane Fisher as described in the document." Diane's lawyer objected, but the judge was unmoved. "Mrs. Fisher," she said directly, "your actions have not reflected the spirit of family or the law. I urge you to accept this ruling and move forward with grace." Helen felt a wave of relief, exhaustion, and vindication wash over her. The crowd erupted in murmurs, some supportive, some stunned. Diane slumped in her chair, lips pressed tight, her dreams of total control shattered. Ms. Walker squeezed Helen's hand. Arthur hugged her, tears in his eyes. "You did it, Helen. You honored your father." Back at the house, Helen paused before entering, looking up at the windows gleaming in the afternoon sun. She let herself inside, breathing in the familiar scent of old wood and garden flowers. Her fight was not just one in the courtroom, it was one in every quiet act of love, every refusal to surrender to fear, every step in her search for the truth. She had reclaimed her father's legacy. But more than that, she had reclaimed her place in her own family's story. Helen's victory in court marked the end of a bitter contest, but it was only the beginning of her journey to restore her father's legacy and the soul of the house. For the first time in months, she walked through every room with a sense of peace, not as an outsider, but as the true steward of her family home. The first thing Helen did was to open the doors wide, to friends, staff, and neighbors who had supported her. She hosted a small gathering in the garden, serving tea and slices of her father's favorite cake. Mrs. Pollard, the retired housekeeper, arrived with flowers and a tight hug. The old gardener, who had watched Helen grow up, brought stories of the orchards Albert had planted for her as a child. There were tears and laughter, and a collective sense that the house had been set right at last. Helen spent days repairing what had been broken or neglected. She rehired staff who had been dismissed by Diane, restoring the gentle hum of busy mornings and the warmth of shared meals in the kitchen. She worked with Arthur and Ms. Walker to sort through the estate, untangling investments, paying off outstanding bills, and carefully cataloging heirlooms. Every letter, photo, and piece of jewelry told a story. Helen made it her mission to preserve not just wealth, but memory. One afternoon, as autumn leaves drifted onto the back patio, Helen found herself alone in her father's study. She pulled out the old ledger, now officially recognized as a guiding document of the estate. In the margins, she discovered notes her father had left for her, small reminders to help those in need, never sell the rosewood piano, and invite the children to play in the garden every spring. Each note was a thread, weaving together the past and the future. Despite the sense of triumph, not everything was easy. Diane remained in the guest cottage, as stipulated by the court, her allowance modest, her presence sullen. She avoided Helen and the main house, retreating into a world of regret and what-ifs. Helen made no move to drive her out. Instead, she treated Diane with distant civility, honoring the boundaries set by the will but refusing to let bitterness take root. There were awkward run-ins in the garden, cool exchanges at the mailbox, but Helen held firm to her dignity. Arthur visited frequently, often sharing tea and old family albums. Together, they remembered Albert, toasting him with his favorite port, promising to keep his legacy alive. Ms. Walker guided Helen through the last legal hurdles, and the local paper published a respectful account of the case, emphasizing Helen's determination and the community's support. Helen also began reaching out to her extended family, inviting cousins for weekends and rekindling bonds that Diane had long discouraged. Laughter returned to the halls, children's footsteps echoed on the old stairs, and the house, which had once felt like a battleground, began to blossom as a true home again. Helen felt a deep responsibility to honor her father's wishes. She set up a scholarship in his name for local students, donated to the church choir he had loved, and started a small community book club in his beloved library. Each gesture was a brick in the foundation of a legacy she intended to grow, not just protect. And on quiet nights, Helen would sit in her father's chair, the garden stretching out beneath the moonlight, the walls echoing with stories and hope. She knew the fight had cost her much, but it had also given her back the greatest gift, belonging. Her father's house was hers once more, not only in deed, but in spirit. As autumn faded and winter's first frost silvered the garden, Helen settled into a new rhythm. With the estate's affairs finally in order and the house restored to its rightful energy, she turned her focus to healing the deeper wounds left by months of conflict. Though Diane remained aloof in the guest cottage, Helen could not ignore the shadow her stepmother cast across the property. There were cold, brief exchanges at the mailbox, and averted eyes at garden gates. But Helen, remembering her father's counsel on compassion, decided not to let anger be her companion. One day, Helen found Diane struggling with groceries at the cottage steps. For a moment, old habits warred with new boundaries. Then Helen simply offered, "Let me help you." Diane hesitated, then surrendered the bags without a word. As they unpacked the food in tense silence, Helen noticed how tired and diminished Diane seemed, her ambition spent, her circle of friends vanished with her claim to the estate. It was a quiet moment, but it cracked open a door Helen hadn't expected, the smallest possibility of peace. Meanwhile, the house filled with life. Helen's cousins visited for the holidays, bringing noisy children who sled down the old hill and built snowmen under the watchful gaze of the garden statues. Arthur joined for Christmas Eve dinner, sharing toasts and old songs by the fire. Mrs. Pollard organized a staff reunion, and the kitchen rang with laughter as they traded stories from years gone by. Helen's book club flourished. Once a month, neighbors and friends gathered in the library to discuss classic novels and swap memories. These evenings became the heartbeat of Helen's new chapter, binding the community together just as her father had always intended. Helen also honored her father's legacy through small acts of generosity, donating books to the local school, sponsoring repairs for the village church, and offering the ballroom for charity events. Each gesture drew the town closer, and old friends, once kept at a distance by Diane's cold rain, returned with warmth and gratitude. Yet not every day was joyful. There were setbacks, old resentments from some distant relatives, awkward run-ins with Diane's former allies, moments when the weight of loss pressed heavy on Helen's heart. She wrote often in her journal, confiding her doubts and fears, but always returning to the steady reassurance of her father's voice in her memory, "Trust yourself, Helen. You are stronger than you know." One evening, as a January snowstorm rattled the windows, Helen received a soft knock at her study door. It was Diane, looking worn and hesitant, an envelope in her hand. "I found this while sorting through some of Albert's things," Diane said quietly, holding out the letter. "It's addressed to you." Helen took the envelope, nodding her thanks. They stood in silence for a long moment, the past stretching out between them. Finally, Diane spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "I'm sorry for everything. I let my fear of being left out become something ugly. You deserved better." Helen's eyes filled with tears. "We both did, Diane. We both loved him." They parted, not as friends, but as two women who had survived a storm, marked by it, but not destroyed. Later that night, Helen read the letter from her father. In it he wrote, "Forgive when you can, for wounds left open will only deepen. The house will endure if you fill it with kindness, not pride." Helen pressed the letter to her heart, feeling the full weight and grace of his wisdom. As winter thawed and new shoots began to push through the soil in the old garden, Helen knew the house was finally at peace, its story one of forgiveness, endurance, and renewal. Spring brought new life to the old Fisher estate. The garden, once overrun and neglected, now bloomed with daffodils and tulips, flowers Albert had planted for Helen as a child. The house, filled with laughter and the rhythms of daily life, no longer echoed with the tension of old battles but with hope and possibility. Helen moved through her days with purpose and contentment. She woke to sunlight streaming through the bay windows, spent her mornings tending to the garden with the gardener's help, and her afternoons organizing community events and hosting neighbors for tea. Each act, however small, stitched new memories into the fabric of the home. Diane kept mostly to the guest cottage, her pride tempered by loss and age. But a quiet understanding developed between the two women. Helen made a point of inviting Diane to family meals, sometimes receiving only a polite refusal, other times sharing a few hours of hesitant conversation. With time, their encounters grew easier, less burdened by the bitterness of the past. Helen saw Diane not as a villain, but as another wounded soul who had loved and lost, just as she had. Arthur remained a steadfast friend. He and Helen spent many evenings in the study, sorting through old letters and laughing over faded photographs. Mrs. Pollard brought in batches of scones for the book club, and the staff, old and new, became more like family than ever before. Helen's outreach in the village flourished. The scholarship in Albert's name helped its first recipient attend university. The local paper published an article about Helen's efforts to preserve both the estate and her father's values. At every turn, Helen's quiet strength and generosity inspired others. Her story became a touchstone in the community, proof that justice and compassion could triumph even after the longest winter. On the anniversary of Albert's death, Helen hosted a memorial in the garden. Family, friends, and neighbors gathered among the blossoms to share stories, music, and food. Helen spoke last, her voice steady and bright. "This house stands because of my father's love, and because we chose, in the end, forgiveness over bitterness. His legacy isn't only in bricks and mortar, but in every kindness we pass on." As dusk fell and lanterns glowed in the trees, Helen felt a peace settle over her. She stood at the edge of the garden, the air fragrant with spring, and closed her eyes, listening for her father's voice in the wind, feeling his presence in every leaf and petal. She had fought for what was rightfully hers, not out of greed, but out of love. Through heartbreak, battle, and healing, she had restored not just a house, but a family and a legacy. In her journal that night, Helen wrote, "True inheritance is more than property or wealth. It's courage, truth, and the grace to forgive. The story of this house will live on, not as a cautionary tale, but as a promise to those who come after. Choose kindness, and you will always belong." The Fisher house, once again alive with hope, stood as a testament to the enduring power of truth, resilience, and forgiveness.